Hello. Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, in Littleton, Colorado, was a perfectly normal morning. Spring had arrived, the sky was clear, and at Columbine High School, conversations revolved around the prom on Saturday. Who's kissing whom? 2 kilometers away, in the basement of a neat suburban house, two teenagers are finishing refilling propane tanks. They've been planning this for 18 months. This basement has become a veritable military base, but nobody sees anything or wants to see anything. They were only 17 and 18 years old. In just a few hours, they would be dressed in black, loading their belongings into their car, driving to high school, and igniting the most important event in American school history. An event so horrifying that soon it would be known by its very name. We just need to say the Columbine Massacre, and everyone will know. But Columbine is also the story of forgotten heroes. A headmaster who risked his life to hide students in a sports equipment storage room. A teacher ran across the wide-open cafeteria, yelling at hundreds of high school students to leave everything behind and run. Those few seconds of bravery saved hundreds of lives. But then, how could two perfectly integrated teenagers, with friends, jobs, and a sure chance of getting into college, spend 18 months preparing the most elaborate plan ever devised against an American high school? What were their real motives? And above all, has the whole truth about the Columbine Massacre really been told 27 years after the event? I relied on two books, Dave Cullen's Columbine and Dessous Claiborne's Columbine, How My Son Could Kill by Dylan, one of the killers, which I think is one of the books that has influenced me most in recent years. But we'll talk about that later. Our story takes place today in Littleton, Colorado, a quiet town of about 40,000 residents a few miles from Denver, a place that's unremarkable, typical of America in the late 1990s. Quiet neighborhoods, neatly manicured lawns, schools renowned for their excellent administration and academic achievements. Bill Clinton is president, the economy is booming, and the internet is beginning to reach every household. Violence is everywhere on screen, but it seems to be in a distant place, taking place in another world. However, two recent events have left a deep impression on the public. In April 1993 in Waco, Texas, the FBI surrounded the headquarters of a religious group for 51 days. The attack ultimately turned into a massacre. A fire devastated the complex, and more than 80 people were killed, including women and children. For some Americans, Waco became a symbol of a state willing to use force against its own citizens. 2 years later, on almost the same day, April 19th, 1995, Timothy McVeigh bombed a federal building in Oklahoma City. He said he wanted revenge for Waco. 168 people died. At the time, it was the worst incident ever to happen on American soil. The debate over gun control persisted, but led nowhere. The Second Amendment was untouchable. Pro-gun lobbying groups were powerful. Efforts to restrict guns stalled. And starting in 1997, in some U.S. states, teenagers began shooting in their own high schools. Each attack was publicized, commented on, and then downplayed as an isolated incident. Schools were unprepared. Even the idea that a high school could be a target was hard to imagine. And besides, everyone knew that only happened to other people, not to Littleton. Well, that was true, and it didn't happen. Until Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, at that very moment, less than 2 kilometers from the high school, in the basement of a pretty suburban house, a teenager was finalizing calculations of student flow times in the cafeteria to determine the precise moment to detonate the bomb he had prepared, aiming for maximum casualties. And absolutely no one, not a single person, anticipated the tragedy that was about to unfold. To truly understand the chaos that occurred at Columbine, one must first observe the sequence of events as if unaware of anything, which is precisely what the victims experienced that day. Then, we will delve into the details, minute by minute, of the victims' stories, as well as those of the murderers. Meanwhile, let's look back at the chaos of Tuesday, April 20th, 1999. Columbine High School was not a compact building, as we often see in French high schools. It was a vast complex, built on terraces, on a hill overlooking parking lots and sports fields. The building alone covered 23,000 square meters, equivalent to 3 football fields comprising numerous buildings, multiple entrances spread across different levels, and parking lots below. At the heart of the school grounds is the commodes area, a large space that serves as both a cafeteria and a hallway. Just above, on the next floor, is the library. To the west, a concrete staircase leads to an elevated entrance overlooking the seniors' parking lot and the lawn where students eat lunch. Years before the attack, renovations altered the building's interior layout. The cafeteria was relocated, and surveillance cameras were installed without a specific security purpose as part of a routine modernization process. However, these cameras captured some rare live footage of the attack. In a world where cell phones were not yet widespread and became a tragic part of American legal history before spreading widely online. These archived images and everything else I found during my research will be posted on my X account for anyone who wants to better understand the chaos of that seemingly endless day. Late in the morning of April 20th, 1999, lunchtime approached at Columbine High School. Students left their classrooms to go to the cafeteria, while others went outside to get some fresh air and sit on the lawn surrounding the building. Spring had truly arrived. The prom had been held a few days ago, and everyone was excitedly discussing who had kissed whom. School was operating as usual, with the typical hustle and bustle of lunchtime. At 11:18 a.m., nothing noteworthy was happening. On the west side of the building, the outdoor staircase connecting the parking lot below to the entrance above remained just an ordinary passageway, used rather haphazardly. At 11:19 a.m., two people appeared at the top of this staircase and paused briefly. From this vantage point, they could observe the entire area surrounding the high school. The scene was normal, almost motionless, until the explosion rang out. The first shots were fired. Sitting on the grass a few dozen meters from the building, two students were having lunch in the sunshine. They were among the groups who chose to stay outdoors during their lunch break. When the gunshots rang out, there was no immediate indication that they were live rounds. The noise was jarring and unusual, but not yet identifiable. Around them, some people stared up motionless, others trying to figure out if the sound was like a firecracker or some kind of staged drama. However, the situation was very real. One of the two students lying on the grass had died from a gunshot wound to the neck. The man was struck and fell to the ground beside them. A short distance away, three students were walking towards the sound. Like everyone else, they hadn't yet realized this was a real attack. The chaos, the screams, the inexplicable erratic movements continued. The confusion dissipated as students continued to collapse one by one. One of them took a few moments to realize that he too had been affected. The pain came later. He tried to return to the entrance he had just come from, but his legs gave way before he could reach it. Around them, the other students scattered in all directions. Some people ran toward the building, others fled, unable to pinpoint the true source of the danger. Some lay flat on the ground or sought shelter behind trees, vehicles, or any obstacle that could provide cover. Some even feigned death, unable to find any cover. Inside, the explosions echoed through the hallways and classrooms, but the cause remained difficult to determine. The sounds were unusual, even somewhat muffled, but there were no indications that it was an attack. In some places, classes continued as normal. Elsewhere, people simply looked up or exchanged glances, as if facing a minor disturbance from outside. Chaos and silence sometimes coexisted just meters apart, but what was happening outside was now seeping into the school. Small explosions were followed by deafening rumbles that shook the walls of the building. In the common area, panic gripped the students. There was no time to think or comprehend. They had to flee. Some, trapped near the cafeteria, crawled under tables, the only makeshift shelters in this vast space, while others rushed toward the emergency exits. After 4 minutes, the fire alarm went off and continued to sound until the massacre ended. A general alert was issued. Its incessant wailing filled the building, but for many, this familiar signal reminded them of a drill, a prank, or a minor incident. However, the situation was extremely chaotic. Those who had escaped were running in all directions. Some were injured, while others locked themselves in classrooms. But the building was too big, the situation too chaotic, the sirens drowning out the gunfire, explosions, and screams, to fully grasp the horror unfolding. Calls to emergency services began pouring in. The first accounts were disjointed and hesitant, but their panic clearly reflected the urgency of the situation. There were reports of gunfire, injuries, and sometimes even explosions. Some mentioned figures in long coats, others described attackers in lighter clothing, but how many were involved? In the chaos, the accounts overlapped without forming a clear picture. 10 minutes after the attack began, the first police cars arrived at the scene. At the same time, an armed school security guard contacted the radio reporting that he had exchanged gunfire with an attacker. The situation became clearer, and emergency services issued a warning. An armed attack had occurred. Teenagers were committing a massacre at Columbine. Mobilize all teams. And a small note, because you need to understand something about the 1999 intervention procedure. Basically, it was very strict. It prohibited police officers from entering the building without completely sealing off the area with yellow tape. No armed assault inside was permitted. So, of course, this procedure was reconsidered and abolished after the Columbine Massacre, and unfortunately, in other mass shootings, police were eventually allowed into the high school. But in Columbine, they were not. The chaos continued. Sporadic gunshots and explosions continued to echo inside the building. Windows rattled violently. Some facades seemed to shake from the explosions. Law enforcement still had no clear picture of the situation. They didn't know who they were dealing with, how many people were inside, or the condition of the remaining students and teachers. Outside, firefighters, paramedics, police, journalists, and parents watched the scene unfold, but without grasping the scale or precise nature of what was happening. Essentially, everyone knew it was a serious incident, but not just how serious. It took over half an hour for the news to reach local television channels. Initial reports indicate a shooting at a high school in suburban Denver. Details remain unclear. According to reports, multiple shots were fired, people were injured, and explosions were heard. Some people are talking about automatic weapons, others about grenades. None of this information has been confirmed. No one is allowed into the building at the scene. Reinforcements were arriving and the encirclement was expanding. Some students who had found shelter were using their cell phones. It's noteworthy that cell phones weren't common at that time. When you're a teenager, it's more of a privilege than a normal occurrence. While some call relatives, others report to television stations and give testimony in person. Authorities quickly banned media outlets from broadcasting information revealing the students' whereabouts, since every classroom in the school had a television. If the shooters could watch the news and get the information, they would know where to go to continue the massacre. Inside the high school, some people figured it out before others. Alerted by the first shots, Principal Frank DeAngelis left his office and went down the hallway toward the sounds. At the same time, a group of young girls in sportswear walked into the lobby, carefree and ready to go outside to play softball in the spring sunshine. They paid no attention to anything. They laughed and joked again. At the end of the corridor, two figures emerged from the west door. The gunmen grabbed their projectiles, crossed the hall, and smashed the trophy display case behind the headmaster. They began shouting for the girls to turn around and run toward them in the opposite direction of the gunfire. They pushed him into a side hallway leading to the gym. The door was locked. They searched his pockets, randomly picking a key from the dozens hanging on his keychain. Luckily, the first key they tried opened the door. He let them in, found a place to hide them, and discovered a storage room full of sports equipment. He locked them inside, promised them everything would be all right, and told them not to open the door to anyone. Then, with extraordinary courage, he decided to go back to evacuate the other students as well as the other teachers, such as Coach Dave Sanders, who went straight to the cafeteria. A noble decision, but he would pay the price for it. We will revisit the final moments and the stories of each victim and hero of that day shortly, because you will see that many did everything they could to limit the scale of the carnage that was unfolding. At 12:56 p.m., nearly an hour after the attack began, the first SWAT team finally entered the building. The men were advancing cautiously. Their task was to check every door, every locker, every room, in order to evacuate the entire high school. This operation was taking time, as every nook and cranny had to be considered a potential trap. Outside, television channels were broadcasting continuously. As time went on, the theories multiplied. 2 gunmen, 3, possibly even more. Some spoke of 6 or 8 men in paramilitary attire. Other sources refer to an organized group. Descriptions vary: black jackets, t-shirts, backward-worn caps. The overall impression was that this was a coordinated operation, far too large to be carried out by just a few teenagers. On the library floor, some teenagers took shelter under tables. Several were injured. Patrick Herland, a student, was beaten multiple times, including one time with a serious head injury. While Bill Clinton was reporting live on the incident, he was interrupted by footage of Patrick jumping from a library window to save himself. We will find out whether he survived later. Around midday, Nate Dykeman called a friend's home number. He expected to get through to an answering machine, but the person who answered was his friend's father, who said his son was in class. Nate insisted that his son wasn't there. He explained to his son that there had been a shooting at the high school, and some witnesses said the shooters were all wearing black coats. The father went upstairs, opened his son's closet, but couldn't find what he was looking for, a black coat. He called 911 to report that his son might be involved. Meanwhile, the media was reporting on a siege. The number of injured varied by channel: 8, 12, 18. At 1:44 p.m., cameras captured the arrest of 3 young men, their hands raised, surrounded by police. The immediate conclusion was that the shooters were caught. It was over. We could pack up. Thank you. But later, history revealed that the 3 arrested were not the perpetrators. In a series of calls, reports, and testimonies gathered by law enforcement, some began to find a connection. Many testimonies highlighted 2 names, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. 2 seemingly mature teenagers, 2 students with no serious criminal records, 2 contrasting paths that no one, not even their parents, could have truly foreseen. As the SWAT team entered the high school to search for the two shooters, the story of Eric and Dylan gradually unfolded, from their childhood to their first meeting to the horrific plan that led to the Columbine Massacre. And you'll see that essentially they're two perfectly normal people. Sure, one of them is mentally ill, but that's normal on this channel. Dylan, on the other hand, is someone who could have been saved mentally. Eric Harris was born on April 9th, 1981, in Wichita, Kansas. His father was an officer in the United States Air Force. His mother chose to stay home to create a stable environment for the family, even though they frequently moved. Over 15 years, Eric spent time in 5 states: Ohio, Michigan, New York, and finally Colorado. He frequently changed schools, often near military bases, where children came and went at their parents' behest. Friendships were temporary, and familiar places were constantly changing. Wayne Harris appears to be a caring and responsible father. The word appears is crucial because, in reality, he won't be present for his son at all. He'll only do the bare minimum, and Eric will grow up without any real guidance, and nobody will care what he's doing in the family garage. During his high school years, Eric underwent surgery to correct a congenital defect called pectus excavatum, a chest deformity that causes the sternum to be abnormally recessed. For a long time, this physical characteristic diminished his self-confidence. To compensate, he tried to appear strong and resilient, more so than he actually was. But Eric is a private person, far more private than the image we might retain of him. However, some fascinating aspects remain. In his stories, he often returns to a childhood memory, a July 4th when he was about 12 years old, the sky filled with fireworks, the explosions echoing like an invasion. He described the suspense of waiting for the fuse to detonate, the pungent smell lingering after the explosion, the tension before the flames erupted. What captivated him was not just the spectacle, but the anticipation, the moment when something was triggered and transformed the space. After a fireworks display, he recounted the burning objects he found around him. The fire drew him in, the flames blazed, the promise hidden in the explosion, the sense of power that came with the blast. In the forests of Michigan, he played soldier with his brother and friends. Branches became grenades, open spaces became battlefields. In his memory, he always occupied a central position. He saw himself as the protector against an ambiguous threat, the protagonist confronting an abstract enemy. He didn't envision himself as a destroyer, but as a strategist, a surviving leader. The emergence of the video game Doom in the early 90s provided him with a more concrete platform to express himself. Enemies had shapes, trajectories, and reactions. Eric excelled. He found a space where his superiority could be clearly demonstrated. He quickly mastered the simple game, modifying the code, creating his own levels, inventing giant creatures, armored warriors, and torn-apart monsters. This wasn't a socially marginalized teenager, nor a boy constantly rejected. He was a smart, adaptable, charismatic young man, but obsessed with an ancient fascination with controlled destruction and a growing belief in his own superiority. In a text message, he wrote that he dreamed of being the last man on Earth. So that's Eric, and you're probably thinking, well, you haven't said much. Okay, let's start by slowing things down a bit, and this is what makes the Columbine Massacre so special. From the moment the two boys meet, things gradually unfold and we learn more details about them. And that's why, for the tragedy to happen, Eric needed a partner. Someone with a completely opposite personality. Dylan. Dylan was born on September 11th, 1981, in Jefferson County, 5 months after Eric. From a young age, he was recognized as having exceptional intelligence. He started school a year early and quickly joined the CHIP program, which had nothing to do with those delicious, crispy potato chips you buy at the supermarket. The best flavor was definitely salt and vinegar. It was a program specifically for gifted students. Even among the best students, he excelled particularly in mathematics. His intellectual prowess didn't hinder him, but it highlighted his social awkwardness. He was younger, taller, and more clumsy in social interactions. It was on this show that he met Brooks Braun, another intelligent, tall, and somewhat unusual boy. The two spent the afternoon at the Braun house playing games, chatting, and nibbling on cookies in the living room while Brooks's mother supervised their impromptu adventures. Dylan was quite reserved with strangers, but in this familiar environment, he became affectionate, almost clingy. Brooks became one of the few people who could get close to this more relaxed side of him. Tom and Sue Klebold's parents met at university. They both studied art before moving on to more practical fields. Tom studied geophysics while Sue studied special education. The Klebold family was well-mannered and intellectual, guided by strong moral values. Dylan grew up in a stable, materially comfortable environment, but not one of excessive wealth. His parents were careful not to indulge his every whim, but beneath that gentle exterior, a fragility was evident from a very young age. His ego was fragile, easily hurt even by the smallest insults. A fall in the mud during a childhood outing was enough to trigger an extreme rage. The laughter of other boys was enough to make him angry. In those moments, Dylan's attitude completely changes, revealing a second, more violent personality. As you learn about him, you realize that we all have a violent side. What really bothers me is that you guys aren't subscribing, and I see that 40% of you are watching without subscribing, even though I'm here every Friday at 6 p.m. It hurts me a lot. I'll let you think about this until the end of this HVF show, but please pay attention. During his teenage years, Dylan's family moved to Littleton and lived in a detached house. At that time, Dylan lived between two worlds: the almost rural environment of his home and the vibrant social life of high school a few kilometers away. The start of middle school marked a turning point. His height bothered him. He was over 1.90 meters tall and always hunched over as if trying to minimize his presence. He considered himself a distorted version of himself, never feeling satisfied. On March 31st, 1997, he opened a notebook and wrote a formal title on the first page: Existence, a Virtual Book. He imagined a hardcover book, almost sacred. He spoke to himself as if no one else could understand. There was no murder involved. The issue lay in loneliness, shame, and a sense of alienation. He spoke of a world that seemed too small for him, a world inhabited by individuals trapped in mental boxes he refused to open. He saw himself as different, but this difference wasn't something to be proud of. She isolated him. He sometimes used the word zombie to refer to other students. His way of thinking sometimes coincided with Eric's, but their intentions were different. Dylan harbored no illusions about being excluded. He observed people from a distance, sometimes with contempt, often with bewilderment. Dylan exhibited all the symptoms of depression. The notebook became a closed space where he could confess things he couldn't express anywhere else. And while Eric associated uniqueness with superiority, Dylan associated his uniqueness with exclusion, and sometimes he said he wanted it all to end. He even mentioned the idea of buying guns. On one side was a potential psychopath, on the other a self-loathing teenager. It remains to be seen how these two met and how they concocted one of the most elaborate schemes the U.S. government has ever had to thwart. No one knows exactly when Eric and Dylan really became close. They met in middle school and continued to see each other in high school. They participated in the same activities, had similar fashion styles, and belonged to the same group of friends. Surrounding them are Brooks Braun, Zach Aker, Nate Dickman, Chris Morris, and Robin Anderson. The latter is Dylan's best friend, confidant, and above all, lover. And yes, the man who always thought he had no chance with women actually has someone right in front of him who is madly in love with him. But Dylan, still lost in his own thoughts and self-sabotage, was completely oblivious. It was insane to think that if the two of them had confessed their feelings, the story of the Columbine Massacre might have been very different. Just as he failed to realize that all these people were actually closer to him than to Eric, but we'll get to all of that later, and you'll see how everyone gradually becomes involved in the story and what their roles are. Brooks Braun, who was on the HPI program with Dylan, returns to the area for high school and joins Eric Dylan's group. All three consider themselves a little bit better than others. They are interested in classical philosophy and Renaissance literature. They cultivate the image of satirical intellectuals, critical observers of a world they consider mundane. Meanwhile, Dylan grows increasingly close to Zach and Claire. Just being in the same class was enough for them to forge a truly close friendship. He even wrote in his diary, "My best friend, the one who has shared, experienced, laughed, taken risks with, and cherished me more than any other friend." They often spent evenings at each other's homes, but mostly at Harris's in the basement that served as Eric's bedroom. A classmate later remarked that they seemed to want to be different, but that was their own choice. In 1997, Eric crossed the line for the first time. Along with Dylan and Zach, they created what they called missions. These missions included vandalizing the homes of children designated by Eric. He was the boss, so he was the one who decided. His standards were low, so he didn't like them. He went home, sneaked away, and walked along the dark fields that Eric likened to a battlefield. The damage was minor. Fireworks were set off near houses. Alarms were triggered. Toilet paper was thrown against walls. Car bodies were smeared. Nothing too serious, but very organized. Eric proudly documented his actions. For Dylan, they mostly gave him a sense of belonging to a group. He enjoyed the intimacy of those evenings, enjoyed his role in the group, but those outings didn't lessen his unhappiness. One side honed his punitive mindset, the other pushed him deeper into despair. They moved forward together, but not for the same reason. One day, a snowball fight got out of control. Eric broke off a block of ice and threw it at several cars. One of them belonged to his friend, Brooke. He broke the windshield, which made him laugh hysterically, and of course he flatly refused to pay for the repairs. Eric had broken it. He certainly wasn't going to fix it. The argument escalated to the point where Brooke's mother had to intervene and wanted to go to the Harris family's house. But with Eric, that was impossible. He flew into an unprecedented rage, started screaming, and clung to the moving car as if he could stop it. Mrs. Brown, terrified, was forced to speed up to make him let go and run away. She was the first to see Eric's true face. He was a psychopath. This isn't my subjective psychological diagnosis, but that of an FBI criminal psychology expert. HVF reports are very serious and have reliable sources, so be careful. But for Eric's parents, youth should be enjoyed, and they wouldn't make a big deal out of it. The most important thing for them was preserving their reputation. The goal was to ensure these reckless actions didn't leave a lasting mark and didn't ruin their son's future. Eric analyzed all of this very carefully, and as usual, he adapted. He admitted just enough to appear sincere. But Eric had more tricks up his sleeve than that. He used his website, yes, because this young genius had a website where he posted everything for everyone to see. He talked about the apocalypse, about his bomb experiments, because he made small homemade bombs, and so it was perfectly natural that he decided to publicly post Brooks's name, address, and phone number on his website and encourage internet users to harass him. He even openly talked about murder. Local residents reported the matter to the sheriff's office multiple times. A deputy investigated and confirmed that the location was indeed somewhat suspicious. He requested a search warrant, but for some unknown reason, the request was denied, and no one discovered what Eric was hiding in the garage. At school, Eric and Dylan continued their daily lives. They worked at Blackjack Pizza. It was manual labor, repetitive, tedious, but any paycheck was valuable to Eric because his big project wasn't free. The boss trusted them, especially Eric, whom he considered serious and reliable, while Dylan lacked reliability. He wasn't a bad employee, but arguably needed constant supervision. Life went on, but Eric didn't give up on his duty and continued to excel. On October 2nd, 1997, Dylan, Zach, and I broke into the school's computer and stole the locker access codes. No one is perfect, so we got caught, and our parents negotiated with the principal to prevent a complaint. The 3 hackers were punished, banned from going out, prohibited from using computers, denied dessert, and forbidden from seeing each other for a month. This punishment will have far-reaching consequences, especially for Dylan, because Zach will be separated from the troublesome trio and even meet someone, a girl he falls in love with. His time will now be dedicated to the relationship, not to missions. Dylan will be very upset about this, seeing it as abandonment and blaming the girl, as evidenced by his diary entries when he learns his best friend has a girlfriend. But it's insane how the urge to kill everyone just because you're upset can be so powerful. Thankfully, nothing like that happens on this channel, can you imagine? Dylan's depression is getting worse. He's lost his guiding light in the darkness. The trio is no longer together. Only 2 outcasts remain, Eric and him. And from there, things escalate. In 1998, Eric and Dylan were still involved in petty crimes, all serving meticulously planned missions. While previously they had limited themselves to throwing toilet paper into people's homes at night, this time they robbed a truck to steal electronics. Unusually, this time they were caught and forced to participate in a 12-month juvenile crime prevention program. For a year, they performed social work, and their academic performance was scrutinized. The goal was to help them get back on track. Eric, who was later labeled a psychopath and possessed extraordinary adaptability, did very well. He used to be a troublesome kid, but now he's a model student, a model citizen. His good behavior is praised, and he rubs his hands together with glee. All of this, in fact, is leading to a chilling thought. He wanted revenge, wanted to unleash the hatred within him, and began fantasizing about planning a massacre. After 12 months of rehabilitation, he was discharged with excellent results and decided to plan a bloodbath. The rehabilitation program worked perfectly. Conversely, Dylan was completely devastated. He, who was usually very intelligent and increasingly less disruptive in class, was now struggling. His grades were plummeting, and he was finding it very difficult to fit into the curriculum. One counselor even remarked, "He always downplays everything, full of excuses, as if he considers himself the victim." No one saw how much depression was tormenting him. He didn't confide in anyone about it and completely neglected himself, drowning his sorrows in alcohol and seeing nothing better than following Eric's plan. The Columbine attack. This is how they prepared for their attack over the course of a year and a half in absolute secrecy. To ensure the plan was perfect, they could count on Eric and his meticulously organized team where nothing was overlooked. For months, he researched, planned, budgeted, and even estimated the number of potential victims. He targeted 2,000 students, over 150 high school staff members, and, dare I say, a few police officers, medical personnel, and journalists. Moreover, everything was documented on paper and video. In the basement, they meticulously documented everything, their purpose certainly not to conceal their identities. They wanted to become stars, role models for all those who, like them, believed humanity had to be plunged into unprecedented chaos. They wanted their actions to serve as an example and be replicated many times over. However, the goal wasn't a typical shootout. Eric was aiming for something much, much higher. He wanted a bombing capable of killing thousands of people in seconds. The use of guns was only a secondary plan, aimed at eliminating any survivors after the explosions. Eric designed at least 7 large bombs based on instructions he found online. The plan was implemented in 3 phases. 1, 2, 3. I count again. Step 1, a diversion. A bomb must explode in a field a few kilometers from the high school. The purpose wasn't to inflict casualties, but rather to create an initial signal, sow chaos, and distract law enforcement. This distraction also served another purpose. Eric knew that Dylan was hesitant, that he didn't want to witness any deaths. He's loyal, that's for sure, but not to the point of actually seeing it through to the end. That's why the first explosion has to be a point of no return. Once triggered, it will only cause material damage, and Dylan will be involved. That would boost his adrenaline and make him more actively involved than if someone died directly. Step 2, the focus of the attack. 2 more bombs must be placed in the Columbine school cafeteria, precisely in the area with the highest student density at lunchtime. Eric had been studying the flow of people coming and going for weeks, taking notes. From 10:30 to 10:50, the cafeteria was still quite empty. From 10:58 onwards, students started arriving in large numbers. At exactly 11:10 a.m., the bell rang, signaling the end of the previous class. The hallway became crowded, and hundreds of students streamed towards the cafeteria. Eric estimated the busiest time was between 11:15 a.m. and 11:20 a.m. That's the window they're targeting. The bomb will be set to detonate a few minutes later. Step 3, the activation phase. Eric and Dylan planned to position their forces outside the building, each covering a different area. The plan was based on infantry-inspired crossfire tactics, maintaining firepower in one area without endangering allies. Eric reassured Dylan that he was in no danger. The cars were also an integral part of the plan. They were there for the grand finale. Eric's Honda and Dylan's BMW were loaded with new bombs, 2 each, and cans of gasoline. These devices were designed to detonate later in parking lots outside after rescue workers arrived in order to prolong the chaos. Eric's notorious bounty money was offered to his victims, but none of this came for free, absolutely not. To kill, you had to arm yourself, and to arm yourself, you have to buy them. So even if you're in a country where that's not an issue, there are still some regulations. You can't sell them to minors. Eric and Dylan were only 17 at the time, so that was beyond their capabilities. And yes, even in the United States, there are gun laws. Well, at most 3 laws. But within their group, there was someone of legal age who could help them without being reported. Robin, 18 and madly in love with Dylan, accompanied them to the Tanner Gun Fair, a kind of arms fair in Denver where you can find used military equipment. There, Eric shopped, choosing to buy a semi-automatic rifle, a carbine, and 2 shotguns. Robin only needed to present her identification. The seller noticed they were accompanied by a woman of legal age. She was only a year older than them, but that was enough. No paperwork, no trace left. The transaction was complete. Have fun. The seller didn't ask any questions, didn't fill out any forms, and didn't provide any paperwork. Why would an 18-year-old girl come to buy 4 semi-automatic guns on a Saturday afternoon with 2 men dressed entirely in black, looking gloomy and utterly dejected? It's quite a mystery. Robin was completely unaware of the plan. She had no idea what he intended to do with his weapons. But nothing was too good for Dylan, and that was all she saw. His weapons were simply an addition to Eric's arsenal. Having experimented with bombs for a long time, he had everything he needed. The basement cupboards were overflowing with supplies, and nobody paid any attention. However, it's important to understand that we're talking about a 17-year-old boy building a military base right in his own home. His parents walk past the basement door every day, and nobody notices. I don't know what to say to you anymore. Eric has a website where he posts everything. He has a military base in the garage, and yet his parents don't care. For them, youth should be lived freely. That's all that mattered. Eric, however, had absolutely no boundaries, and his parents let him do as he pleased. In early 1999, he completed a program for delinquent youth. Eric is on top of the world, while Dylan has fallen into the abyss. They regain their freedom and can finally pursue their plans of over a year, prepare for prom, and start college like everyone else. The problem is, Eric has no plans for the following year, because for him, there is no after April 19th. But to dispel his father's doubts, he still went to an interview with a recruiter, though he didn't see it through. But that was enough to put his father's mind at ease. Meanwhile, for Dylan, the story was completely different. He got accepted into a university in Arizona. He even visited the campus with his dad. He has a bright future, and he always talks about it. In reality, both of them had a future no matter what, as the pizza shop where they worked guaranteed them jobs after graduation. However, in Eric's mind, everything was clear. It would all end soon. The plan was ready, the bombs were ready, the weapons were ready, only a specific day remained, and Eric had circled that date on his calendar months in advance. Before the massacre took place, there was another event, the prom, scheduled for April 17th. This obligatory event was so eagerly awaited that it marked many firsts. Dylan is dating Robin. Who else could it be? Brooke, Nate, Zach, and Chris are all riding in a limousine. Dylan is having a great time and talking about the future. He insists they should all keep in touch after graduation because they're having such a good time together. He genuinely expressed his excitement for the next chapter in Arizona. He was just like any other high school student. Only Eric was different. He had no girlfriend, no dates, no prom. According to Eric, 3 days before the apocalypse, the students at Columbine High School were dancing, laughing, flirting, and dreaming about the future. And while the school was celebrating prom, the bombs and weapons for the attack were waiting in a basement 15 minutes away, ready to plunge America into terror. The only problem is nothing happened on April 19th. And no, I didn't get the date wrong. Eric just canceled the plan at the last minute because he realized he didn't have enough ammunition. So he ordered more on the black market. As a child, Eric dealt with Man, none other than a cheap arms dealer in Denver who sold all sorts of things for a living: guns, ammunition, drugs, but he was unreliable. He didn't deliver on time, and worse, he disappeared. But luckily for Eric and his crazy plan, on the evening of April 19th, his phone rang. The ammunition boxes had arrived, and it would cost $25. Without a moment's hesitation, he rushed to get them. The exchange was brief, and before leaving, Man asked him a harmless question. "Are you going hunting tonight?" "No, but maybe tomorrow." On the morning of April 20th, Eric and Dylan woke up early as usual. The weather was hot, the sky was clear, promising a beautiful day. Dylan left home around 5:30 a.m. His parents were still asleep, but they still called out softly, "Sit down," as he entered the door. Usually on Tuesdays they would go bowling before school, but today they would skip the morning, which would certainly be noticed by some of their friends, especially since an important psychology test was coming up. Eric and Dylan stopped by a convenience store to buy the last of the gas canisters for their bomb. Eric had been designing them for months, but he deliberately delayed buying them until the last minute because they were too bulky, making hiding them at his house too risky, especially since his closet was already full of guns. Around 7 a.m., they arrived at Eric's house. Eric filled the gas tanks. Dylan collected the gasoline. Everything was timed perfectly. Half an hour for assembly, an hour for setup, eating, and relaxing. The atmosphere here was unusually quiet. Just before 11 a.m., they loaded their weapons, reins, and ammunition belts onto the vehicles, then draped their long black coats over them. They left behind what needed to be left behind. The farewells were recorded and left on the kitchen counter as videotapes. They placed a diversion bomb in a field, drove to the high school, and each parked in a different parking lot. All the timers were set to detonate simultaneously. At exactly 11:17 a.m., precisely 11:14 a.m., in the high school security room, the janitor arrived and pressed the pause button to rewind the VHS footage from the cafeteria camera. The live image vanished from his screen. It was the most perfect moment in the history of janitor making in America. No one could have predicted this, not even the worst B-movie script on Netflix. The director cuts the scene right as the two teenagers walk into the school with 15 kilograms of explosives on their backs, leaving them completely undetected. For several minutes, there's no footage of what's happening, and it was during this break that the two boys sneaked into the common area and crossed the space between about 500 students carrying large bags full of explosives. No one noticed them. The bombs were placed at the base of the pillars exactly as planned. But that part would never be recorded, as the receptionist wouldn't turn the security cameras back on until 11:22 a.m. Eric and Dylan returned to their car, awaiting the explosions and thus the second phase of the plan. Brooke went outside to smoke in the parking lot and saw Eric. Annoyed at failing his psychology test, he confronted Eric, saying that Eric was messing things up. Eric calmly told him that it didn't matter anymore. Then he added something else, which surprised Brooke, but he didn't press the matter further. He left the school grounds and went home, completely unaware that he had just narrowly escaped death. At 11:18 a.m., the school was still open. Everything was proceeding as usual. The students left the cafeteria, grabbed their trays, walked through the glass doors, and sat down on the grass. Some had finished eating, others were leaving the campus. Nothing happened. The activation system, based on old mechanical alarm clocks, wasn't very accurate. The small hand was positioned between 3 and 4, but there was still a small margin of error. Eric knew this. With each passing second, the target receded. Dozens of students left the area. The crowd thinned, the perfect opportunity closed, the bomb should have exploded. It was time to switch to Plan B. But there was no plan B. Everything had been perfectly arranged. He couldn't possibly be wrong, and now everything had fallen apart. Okay, then we pack our bags, go see a psychologist to calm down, and that's it. We don't talk about this anymore. Unfortunately, given how things started with the HVF, you can guess that this wasn't Eric's choice. But for Eric, failure wasn't an option. He'd been planning this massacre for a year and a half. Columbine would die today, and that was it. So they were left with only one option: get out of the car and meet at the top of the outdoor staircase on the west. This new location prevented them from using their planned crossfire tactics. At 11:19 a.m., they opened their bags, attached their pistols, loaded their semi-automatics, and Eric yelled. Almost immediately, Eric turned and fired. He shot toward the lawn, toward the trees, toward the students climbing the stairs. Dylan fired very little, shouting, cheering, and laughing. Eric sprayed pepper spray into the area. Rachel Scott was standing near Richard Castaldo, who was sitting on the grass. Eric fired his gun, and Richard was hit in the arm and torso. Rachel was shot in the chest and then in the head. She died with her neck slumped. The Columbine school shooting began. Richard remained motionless, feigning death. Danny Rohrbaugh, Lance Kirkland, and Sean Graves advanced toward the west staircase, thinking they were witnessing a joke. Eric turned around and fired. A bullet pierced Danny's knee. He fell. A second shot hit his heart. A third hit his stomach. Danny collapsed onto the concrete floor. He died instantly. Lance tried to lift him up. He was hit repeatedly. He collapsed onto the grass. Sean burst out laughing. He was still thinking about the paintball game. A paintball grazed his neck. Another hit him in the back. He didn't immediately realize he'd been hit, then the pain struck, and his legs gave way. He crawled toward the entrance. Eric saw a group of students sheltering under the pine trees. He fired his gun. One man fell and pretended to be dead. Another was hit by a bullet, but luckily escaped. Lance regained consciousness. He saw a figure above him. He grabbed Eric's trouser leg and pleaded for help. "Of course I'll help you," Eric replied before shooting Lance straight in the face. But Lance was still breathing, and Eric didn't realize it. Dylan walked down towards the entrance. Sean was leaning against the door, pretending to be dead. Dylan stepped over him and went into the cafeteria. Inside, everyone was in utter panic. Students sought shelter under tables. Others ran toward the stairs. Coach Dave Sanders heard gunshots and rushed toward the cafeteria. Initially, he ordered the students to lie down, but immediately changed his mind upon hearing the gunfire and seeing Dylan approaching. "Run! Run! Get out of here!" He ran across the open cafeteria, waving his arms to direct the students toward the main staircase leading to the second floor. Approximately 488 people were present at the time. Nearly 100 students were trapped in the narrow stairwell, squeezed between metal railings. Dylan stood at a safe distance, in the perfect position. Just a small bomb could turn the staircase into a deadly trap. He raised his weapon, surveyed the room, then turned outside and went to where Eric was at the top of the stairs. The scene of Dylan confronting hundreds of students on the stairs will be analyzed thousands of times by psychologists. For them, it's the ultimate proof that Dylan was just a follower, not a murderer. Eric, on the other hand, wouldn't hesitate to commit a massacre, but we'll come back to that later. Minutes earlier, the lawn had been bustling with students enjoying lunch in the sun. Now it was teeming with figures fleeing. Eric, who had taken a moment to relax and remove his jacket, spotted Anne-Marie in a shelter near the sidewalk of the senior citizens' parking lot. He tracked her through his rifle scope and fired. The bullet struck her, but she managed to get up and move forward. He fired again, and this time she fell to the pavement. A teammate immediately appeared, grabbed her arms, and pulled her toward the building entrance to get her out of the line of fire. He dropped her off in the back of a car and drove away. A few seconds later, a small bomb exploded right there. Eric was overjoyed. Amazing. Unbelievable. At the same time, the emergency call center received its first report. A young girl was injured in the senior citizens' parking lot. The voice on the phone said they thought the girl was paralyzed. A flood of calls will pour in, quickly overwhelming the emergency communication system. The area outside the campus will empty at breakneck speed. Those who can run will run. Those who could hide did. A last group remained outdoors in the distance, crossing the parking lot, climbing over the wire mesh fence, and running toward the sports field. Eric fired at them. Dylan also fired at the moving figures. Nothing seemed to stop them. In 4 minutes, Eric fired 47 rounds with his 9mm rifle. For his part, Dylan only used the small-arm submachine gun 3 times and the shotgun twice. He then proceeded toward the cafeteria. On the way, he encountered Gardner, a deputy sheriff in charge of school security, who was getting out of his car. 2 shots briefly grazed the parking lot above. Gardner took cover behind a door. Eric's rifle jammed. He tried to unlock it. Dylan, now closer to the entrance, stepped into the building. Eric managed to fire another burst of short bursts, then retreated and disappeared inside. Gardner rushed to the radio to report an ongoing shooting and request emergency backup. Gardner tried to provide his location, but had difficulty finding an empty communication channel. At the same time, north of campus, another deputy under Sheriff Paul Smoker, who was issuing a speeding ticket near Claymont Park, heard the call and ran across the lawn to the main gate as fast as he could. Remaining reinforcements arrived and a security perimeter was established. Yellow tape marked the safe zone. The order was that no one was allowed to enter. Witnesses, journalists, and family members arrived at the scene almost immediately, at the same time as the police. A command center was established, and authority was given to the new police chief, John Stone, who had never encountered a murder case in his career. And now he found himself in the midst of the Columbine High School massacre. Remember that name? We'll come back to his case and how he handled the crisis later. Meanwhile, inside the cafeteria, Eric and Dylan were throwing small homemade bombs around. The fire alarm also went off, drowning out the screams and gunshots, making it difficult to pinpoint the gunman's location. The two of them hurried down the hallway and towards the library on the upper floor. From now on, all the events I'm about to tell you will unfold simultaneously over a 3-hour period because the SWAT team didn't intervene immediately. The school was in complete chaos, and aside from the teachers, no one came to help the students. Be prepared. Patty Nilsson, a teacher in the science lab near the library, heard a commotion and thought it was a prank. She went outside and saw a boy shooting at the glass, which she assumed was a toy gun. Annoyed but confident, she approached and ordered him to stop. A student followed her. Eric saw them through the glass partition, raised his gun, aimed at Patty, and smiled. Before he could pull the trigger, the glass shattered. The bullet grazed the teacher's head. Seeing the large hole in the glass, she realized it wasn't a toy. She screamed for help, while a second shot sent shards of glass and metal into her shoulder. She and the other student crawled and retreated into the library. The other students remained in the classroom Patty had left behind. Coach Dave Sanders heard gunshots aimed at Patty. He ran in that direction. When he arrived, he found Patty and the student sheltering in the library. Dave found himself just meters from Eric. He turned to change direction but was shot in the back. The bullet pierced his ribcage and exited through his chest. Eric fired a second shot, hitting Dave Sanders in the back of the neck. Dave Sanders collapsed next to a locker, lying in a pool of blood. Another teacher nearby rushed to help while Eric and Dylan continued throwing bombs as they advanced toward the library. The teacher dragged the coach into the science lab, where several students were still standing and staring in horror at their coach, who had lost half his jaw. The teacher made all the students stand along the walls because the lab had glass walls. Meanwhile, in the library, Patty Nilsson was calling 911. She described 2 boys as having weapons. She reiterated that someone was injured. Behind her, 34 students were hiding under desks, between bookshelves against a glass wall. Some wept. Others were struck speechless. Footsteps approached the hallway, and immediately the first bullets struck the glass facade of the library. The glass shattered, sending shards flying onto tables and onto the students huddled below. A sudden scream erupted. Amidst the screams, the fire alarm continued to ring. The door burst open. Dylan took off his jacket to feel more comfortable before going inside with Eric. He fired continuously from the doorway. Bullets pierced the wooden shelves, punctured computer screens, and lodged in the walls and bookshelves. Books were scattered all over the floor. Dust flew everywhere, and the air was filled with smoke and shrapnel. Patty was still manning the 911 switchboard behind the counter. The operator heard the gunfire getting closer, heard screams, and realized the 2 boys were inside the library. Patty tried to whisper information through the noise. Eric walked down the aisle, his rifle raised to shoulder level. He paced back and forth, searching for students hiding under desks. He slammed his hand on one of the tables, bent down, and spoke. He fired a shot into Cassie Bernal's head. She died instantly, without him actually seeing who she was, especially since the recoil of the rifle had broken her nose. "Oh, my nose is broken!" He turned around, his face covered in blood, and confronted Brie Pascal. She was praying. He stared at her, pointed his rifle at her, and asked if she believed in God. She answered yes. Did she want to die? No. Did she want to die? No. Brie begged her not to kill her. Eric laughed and told Dylan that everyone was going to die anyway. Dylan encouraged him, "Just kill her!" But Eric refused. He'd rather blow everything up. So perhaps the blow to the face with the butt of the rifle deterred him from using his weapon. We're not sure. Furthermore, he initially wanted to blow everything up, but nothing exploded except for the bomb placed as a decoy in the field next door, which nobody paid attention to because of what was happening at the school. Therefore, that part of the plan failed completely. Dylan moved between the rows of tables in the library. He peered under the tables, searching for crouching figures, exposed legs, shoes protruding from the tabletops. Mikhail had bumped his knee under a table near the entrance. Patrick, another student, lunged toward Mikhail to put pressure on his knee. In that movement, his head jutted out and Dylan fired toward him, the bullet lodging in the table and piercing the wood. Several shrapnel fragments lodged in Patrick's head. Other fragments remained embedded in his scalp, likely pieces of wood broken off from the table during the explosion. But one bullet had penetrated nearly 15 centimeters of brain tissue before lodging in the back of his head. Part of his visual center was destroyed. His ability to speak was almost completely destroyed. The left hemisphere of his brain controls the right hemisphere, and because the bullet severed this connection, he was paralyzed on the right side, meaning he didn't feel at all that he had also been shot in the leg, which was now shattered and bleeding profusely. Therefore, he lay motionless, drifting in and out of consciousness. At 12:06 p.m., the SWAT team took their positions and entered the building. Having been uninformed about changes made to the school 2 years prior, the lieutenant commanding the SWAT team, while familiar with the high school, was unaware that the cafeteria had been relocated. Therefore, they moved through the building completely unsuspecting. The headmaster will guide them after the evacuation so they can find the cafeteria, the classrooms, and especially the library, where Eric and Dylan were last seen during the shootout. Meanwhile, Patrick has regained consciousness and his survival instincts have kicked in. He is positioned 2 desks away from the window. He began to crawl, half his body immobile and his vision completely gone. He was completely disoriented and went in the wrong direction, but realized his mistake and headed towards the light, towards the window. This process was prolonged because he kept losing consciousness, and the trail of blood he left behind showed that he had lost a lot of blood. Along the way, the boy encountered obstacles that he pushed aside: table legs, chairs, and even dead bodies. He continued relentlessly toward the light from the window, hoping that someone would see him from the window or that he could jump out. All of this would take him 3 hours. Meanwhile, in the science lab, the students who knew first aid were stopping Dave's bleeding and bandaging his wounds as best they could. It was 11:45 a.m., and emergency services had been called and were expected to arrive in less than 10 minutes. They would repeat this information for 3 hours, meaning that during those 3 hours, the students would do everything they could to keep Professor Dave Sanders conscious. Dave knew he was going to die. He said it and told his daughters that he loved them. Then he passed out. His condition was critical. Around noon, a sign reading, "A man is bleeding to death," was posted on one of the outward-facing windows to alert emergency services. In the library, Patrick finally reached the window with great difficulty and with a fierce will to live. He clung to a chair and climbed up to get a better look. A SWAT team stationed outside spotted him and approached to intercept him. Quickly, they positioned a vehicle under a first-floor window. They were about to climb into the car. Patrick was completely panicked. He could only think of one thing: to get out. The SWAT team yelled, "Stay here, we're coming!" But nothing could stop Patrick. He leaped headfirst out the window. 2 SWAT officers restrained him by grabbing his arms and holding him back, preventing further injury. Without their intervention, he would certainly have died. In a state of shock, as they put him into the vehicle to take him away, Patrick struggled and tried to run away. He spoke incoherently and was panicking. He lost a lot of blood, but he was rushed to the emergency room. Patrick Harland is the miraculous survivor in this story. At 11:47 a.m., the SWAT team finally arrived at the science lab. The initial terror gave way to relief and cheers of joy, but this was immediately silenced by the officers' shouts ordering them to be quiet and leave in single file, hands on their heads. The students resisted. They couldn't get off the bus. The SWAT officer repeated the order: "Everyone get out." The injured were not to be brought inside. 2 SWAT officers would stay near the coach and relay information to the teams outside that urgent medical services were needed at the science lab, but until a doctor was found, they needed to safely get him inside through the corridors. Dave collapsed, and when the doctor arrived at the scene, all he could do was declare him dead. In fact, the doctor found Dave wasn't breathing, and according to emergency protocol, if someone is no longer breathing, nothing should be done to save time. Therefore, no CPR, nothing at all. We didn't try anything. Dave Sanders, like all the other deceased, will be left at the scene. His heroic act will be remembered. We will talk about the lives of the victims again later. But if Dave Sanders hadn't stormed the cafeteria, despite the gunfire to disperse the students and raise the alarm, the death toll could have been much higher. After 3.5 hours of siege, the students emerged one by one, clutching their heads. They left the cafeteria and were safely guided to the first aid area. Outside, they walked past the bodies. The bodies of Danny Rohrborg and Rachel Scott lay there, exposed to everyone's view. The bodies were not moved or covered and would remain there for more than 48 hours. The media, having only witnessed the scene firsthand, were wondering where these children had come from. After all this time and chaos, no one really expected that so many survivors were still inside. At 3:15 p.m., the SWAT team finally arrived at the library. Inside, it was a horrific scene of carnage. Bodies lay scattered under the tables. Blood was everywhere. Upon searching the entire area, they discovered 2 bodies near the row of computers, which were not hidden under the desks, and weapons scattered on the floor nearby. They were Eric and Dylan lying in pools of blood. Their weapons had been turned toward them. Based on the victims' descriptions, the SWAT team identified them and confirmed that the attack had ended. In fact, the attack ended at 12:08 p.m. and lasted 49 minutes. The SWAT team entered the building 2 minutes before they were killed. Within 3 hours, the search team had tracked down the 2 dead shooters. Of the 34 students hiding in the library, 10 were found dead. Cassie Bernal, Stephen Kernow, Corey D. Pooter, Kelly Fleming, Matthew Ketcher, Daniel Mother, Lauren Townsend, John Tomlin, Kyle Velasquez, and Isa Choles. 49 minutes of chaos, 3 hours of intervention, 13 dead, 23 injured, 2 perpetrators arrested. Columbine High School thought the nightmare was over, but no one knew that the worst might yet be to come. Immediately following the attack, things began with a press conference chaired by Sheriff John Stone, the man you'll hate later in this HVF, High Intensity, news broadcast. Speaking at 4 p.m., journalists who had waited all day captured unprecedented footage, broadcast live. It was a first, but they had no accompanying information, so they had a lot of questions, which was fine because the police chief had no answers anyway, since the SWAT team was still searching for and evacuating students and no official report had been released. But it's in improvisation that you recognize excellent actors, so here's the next part. Initially, he announced an extremely high preliminary casualty figure, 25 dead. This figure was, of course, widely circulated in the media, although it was more than double the actual death toll of 13 or 15 if Eric and Dylan were included. However, it was closer to the number of injured, which was 23. Sources claimed the attackers were dead and raised the possibility of a third gunman being involved in the attack. Similarly, misinformation is also spreading. He claimed that the 3 students apprehended in the nearby park might be accomplices or relatives of the shooters. This is completely false because the 3 unfortunate teenagers he referred to had no connection whatsoever to Eric and Dylan and were quickly exonerated, thankfully for them. The police chief had just held his first major press conference. The result? Double the death toll, 1 gunman never existed, 3 accomplices found innocent, a resounding victory, and that wasn't even the worst of it. Wait and see. Late in the afternoon, a shuttle service was set up to safely return the students to their families. Each ride was awaited as a relief, but as night fell, the families of those who couldn't return were still there, waiting. The authorities assured them that the next bus would come, but it never did. The Attorney General had a list of the 12 students and coach who had died, but instead of releasing it, he simply told the families, "Be optimistic, don't worry." Parents would learn of their son or daughter's death too late, desperately waiting for the last bus that would never arrive. Outside, the bodies of Rachel and Danny, who had fallen within the first few minutes, were never covered or moved. They lay there for 48 hours, in front of everyone, enduring all kinds of harsh weather conditions. Danny's father learned of his son's death the next day from the newspaper. His face was blurred, but he immediately recognized his son lying on the school lawn. As night fell, bomb disposal experts arrived to recover the unexploded ordnance. They had to be moved out of the secure area and detonated in a protected location. At 10:30 p.m., an explosion was heard. While loading the bombs onto the vehicle, an incident caused the blast. Miraculously, no one was injured. The preliminary findings of the investigation into the Harris and Klebold families were released the following day. Whether you're surprised or not, the Harris family was completely uncooperative. Mr. Harris vehemently declared his son innocent, stating that he had nothing to do with the incident, but the authorities remained undeterred and persevered. Eventually, they found so much evidence that they had to investigate throughout the night. In Eric's basement, they found his diary, all the documents used to plan the attack, bomb-making materials, and even traces of an explosion in the garden. Meanwhile, at the Klebold's house, things happened quickly. They opened the door and let them in immediately, but there was nothing there except Dylan's diary. Even within their own family, these 2 personalities were completely opposite. In fact, we'll hear more about Dylan's family later, who will speak out publicly. In the following days, a dozen students were summoned to help reenact the events. This was just the beginning. Over 500 more interrogations would be conducted in the following days. Brooks, Nate, Zach, Chris, and Robin were not spared either. They were questioned and provided astonishing evidence. Weapons and bombs weren't a secret, firstly because Eric talked about everything on his website, and secondly because Dylan had proudly brought a small bomb to work. Zach had gotten angry with him and told him to put it away and never bring it back. This latest incident widened the gap between them, but it also implicated Zach, because in a way, he knew the 2 boys were preparing a bomb. They all knew to varying degrees. Nate had heard about the mini-bombs. He'd even seen one during the Super Bowl and said nothing. As for the psychics, they all knew about them too, but they didn't know why, and that's what helped them get identified in the attack. Robin was forced to admit that they had indeed obtained the weapons using his valuable identification. Because Eric and Dylan were no longer alive to pay the debt, Robin, Mann, the arms dealer, and Chris, who connected Eric to the arms dealer, were convicted for their involvement. They were ordered to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in restitution to the plaintiffs. The same thing happened with the Harris and Claybold families, but they had insurance, so the insurance covered his expenses. Among the documents found in Eric's basement were also videos of the infamous farewell and plans. They contained everything. But after watching the footage, the police chief, and I quote verbatim, shocked by what he saw, decided to hide it. Officially, it was to protect the public and families. Unofficially, it was far more convenient given that the Trenchcoat Mafia, a bizarre high school student organization that Eric and Dylan were supposedly members of simply because they assaulted others while wearing long black coats, still existed, but we'll talk about that later. However, the truth is still being kept secret because, essentially, the police chief is embarrassed for not realizing Eric and Dylan's plan in time, while Eric was posting everything on his website. So he's completely obstructing the investigation. But Chief Stone wasn't finished yet. The preliminary investigation files relating to Eric, his website, Ebron's allegations that Eric had threatened to kill her on his website, they were all gone. Not a trace. And the police chief would publicly declare on national television that he knew nothing about it. That's untrue. He even called Brooks, the victim of Eric's harassment, a liar and accused him of complicity in the attack. In fact, in a secret meeting, dozens of local officers reviewed the case. Sheriff Stone then decided to drop the entire case and adamantly denied any knowledge of Eric's deviant behavior and dangerousness. All of this contributed greatly to the myths surrounding the Columbine Massacre and was accepted as truth for many years. And there are three misunderstandings I want to clarify. First is the story about the Longcoat Gang that everyone's talking about because Eric and Dylan attacked the school in black long coats. Basically, it's just high school students who gave themselves that name because of their distinctive style of dress. Nothing more, nothing less. Eric and Dylan were never members of that group, but in the media, associating them with some mysterious organization at high school was sensational. The second, and most persistent myth, is that Eric and Dylan were bullied in high school and their actions were revenge against their bullies. This version appears everywhere, in movies, documentaries, conversations, whenever the Columbine Massacre is mentioned. This is a convenient story, neatly laid out. Two marginalized teenagers seeking revenge. The problem is, it's not true. Investigations have shown that Eric and Dylan were not severely bullied. They had a stable group of close friends: Brooke, Zach, Nate, Chris, Robin, a job at a pizza parlor where the owner liked them, a Cavalier prom for Dylan, and limousine rides with friends. Eric ran a website, Dylan kept a diary. None of them mentioned any lasting harassment experiences. They deliberately positioned themselves as outsiders, cultivating an image of intellectual superiority and mocking classmates they deemed stupid. Eric bullied Brooke, not the other way around. Yet this myth persists because it provides a sense of security. If the murderers are victims who have lost control, then school bullying is the real culprit, and we know what to do to address that. But the truth is even more disturbing. Eric is an organized psychopath. Dylan suffered from severe depression. Neither of them had any clear objective reason to commit murder. What is undeniable is the psychiatric report on the killers, compiled by FBI criminal psychology expert Dwayne Fusilier. Analyzing their behavior and writings, he described Harris as a perfect psychopath: charming, emotionless, deceitful, cunning, ridiculously arrogant, extremely selfish, and utterly lacking in empathy. True psychopaths possess two main characteristics. The first is a cruel contempt for others. They can deceive, hurt, or kill without remorse, sometimes for the most trivial reasons. Secondly, they possess an astonishing ability to conceal this true nature. It is this manipulative talent that makes them so dangerous. They know how to appear normal, trustworthy, and sometimes even amiable. You can never predict their actions. Dylan, a criminal psychology analyst, described him as resembling a severely depressed young man. In both cases, he believed he was fully capable of understanding their actions and that, if they survived, they could be tried and held accountable. Furthermore, in the final videos recorded before their arrival at Columbine, Eric and Dylan say goodbye to their loved ones, telling them they are going to another world and that they regret the trouble they are about to cause. But beyond analysis, debate, and controversy, Columbine remains, above all, a human tragedy. On April 20th, 1999, 13 people were killed. 12 students and 1 teacher. Rachel Scott was only 17 years old. She was passionate about theater and writing. She dreamed of making a positive impact on the world. Danny Rorbu was 15 years old at the time. He is an energetic and loyal boy, passionate about video games and very close to his family. Kyle Velasquez is 16 years old. He is a quiet student with a disability known for his kindness and love of computers. Cassie Bernal is 17 years old. She's a teenager who has rediscovered her faith and wants to help others. Stephen Curnow is 14 years old. He's a curious boy who loves science and dreams of becoming an engineer. Corey D. Pooter is 17 years old. He's a loyal friend and a thoughtful young man, looking forward to finishing high school soon. Kelly Fleming is 16 years old. She's a creative young girl who loves writing stories and dreams of becoming a writer. Matthew Kester is also 16 years old. He's a cheerful, energetic high school student known for his kindness and sense of humor. Isaiah Showles is 18 years old. He's a charismatic guy, passionate about sports, and very protective of his friends. John Tomlin is 16 years old. He is a generous and very religious boy, known for his kindness to everyone. Lauren Townsend is 18 years old, an excellent student involved in many school activities and well-liked by everyone. Daniel Moser is 15 years old. He is a curious and enthusiastic teenager who enjoys debating and exploring the world around him. Finally, Dave Sanders is 47 years old. He was a respected teacher and coach, nearing retirement to spend the rest of his life with his family. Among the survivors, some would carry the scars of the Columbine Massacre for life. Patrick Herland had to undergo years of rehabilitation to recover from his injuries. Wheelchair, crutches, long-term therapy, his recovery was slow. Today, he walks and talks normally, although the brain injury has left him with memory problems and seizures requiring lifelong treatment. During his convalescence, when his mother expressed her anger about what he had suffered, Patrick explained to her that he had forgiven Eric and Dylan and that he just wanted to focus on his life and future. He continued his studies, built a successful career, and got married. At his wedding, his classmates from Columbine High School and his former headmaster, Mr. DeAngelis, witnessed him gracefully lead his first dance. And like many other survivors, they remained close friends. Over 200 students were united by that fateful day. Sue Klebold, Dylan's mother, eventually wrote a book titled Columbine, How Could My Son Kill?, which I personally read and which deeply moved me because Sue made absolutely no excuses for her son. She spoke about Dylan, the person he was, the things she didn't see in him, and the love she had for him until the moment she knew he might be one of the murderers. She wrote, "Like all other mothers, I prayed for my son's safety. When I heard the presenter talk about the 25 deaths, my prayers changed. If Dylan is harming or killing people, then he must be stopped." As a mother, this was the hardest prayer I had ever offered in the quietude of my soul. But I understood it at that moment. The greatest grace I could ask of heaven was not for my son to be safe and healthy, but for him to die. As for Eric's parents, they kept their mouths shut as tightly as possible. They never really spoke out. No interviews, no books, complete silence. They went on with their lives without anyone really knowing what they thought, what they regretted, or what they understood about the son they had raised. They knew Eric was preparing a large-scale military operation in their basement without their knowledge. Dylan's parents, on the other hand, did the complete opposite. They refused to conceal the truth, condemned their son's actions, and offered a sincere apology. Therefore, Sue wrote a deeply moving and truly engaging book, offering insightful perspectives on the victims' families. She frequently gives presentations and works with disease prevention organizations. 27 years after the Columbine Massacre, not everything has been made public. A significant portion of the documents and recordings related to the videos made by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold remained classified. In April 2007, a federal judge finally ruled on the matter. He acknowledged that there was a genuine public interest in making these documents public, particularly to better understand the tragedy and perhaps to prevent similar attacks from recurring. But he also believed that immediate publication could do more harm than good. So, a compromise was reached. The records were sealed in the National Archives for a period of 20 years. Therefore, the whole truth will only be revealed in 2027. If you have seen this HVF hand, please post your IC in the comments. This is a very difficult HVF hand to analyze. It was necessary to find the right balance between the truth, the horror of those truths, the story of the murderers, and at the same time, to give a voice to the victims. I hope I succeeded. I look forward to your feedback. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. That would be great support. For those who want to see more old videos, I've uploaded them all to my EX account. This is Max Case. We'll meet again next Friday at 6 p.m. to hear a news story. Quote, as both true and horrifying. Goodbye.